Today we're going to go over 10 tips to help you climb the rank ladder in Legends of Runeterra. And even though we're going to go through some examples in this video, if you want to see how I apply these tips, do check out my other gameplay videos. My first tip is to think about the mulligan. It's really important that you mulligan correctly in any card game, just because it sets you off on the right foot. The first thing you need to consider when mulliganing is what your opponent's deck is and what pace do they play as. Generally, it fits into 3 categories: aggro, mid-range, and control. If your opponent has an aggro game plan, usually you need to look for a way to survive early, and generally I would hard mulligan for either my early units or early removal spells to help me survive early. If I'm against a control deck on the other side of things, I will actually look for my key units that I need to be dropping on curve. The other thing you need to consider is what is your opponent's game plan? How do they win? And do you have good cards to counter that? Because if you run a 1 of or maybe 2 of good cards to counter their game plans and you throw it away in the mulligan, you're not always going to get that back. My second tip is to play around your opponent's removal. And removal has many forms. Don't just think about spells, but there are also units, challenger effects, vulnerable effects. All of these I consider removal, and you need to be playing around them as well as you can. And when playing around removal, always assume your opponent has the worst case scenario spell for you. And to help with this, going forward, I'm going to be releasing a cheat sheet of the key cards you need to play around in every meta deck. And use an example from the game we've already seen a bit of already. I play my River Shaper knowing it can die to removal. And then when my opponent uses the Mystic Shot, I make the unusual decision not to protect it. And this is because, firstly, even if I use the combat trick, my opponent could have more removal spells and still win the trade. And additionally, and most importantly, on the following turn, when I drop Shen, I need a card to protect him. Because currently, if I drop Shen will die to Thermo Beam and I would have no way to protect him. By banking these 3 spell mana, I keep Shen out of Thermo Beam range and therefore safe. My next tip is hand reading, and this really feeds into the previous tip of playing around your opponent's removal, because often you'll have a choice of what to play around. Do you play around A or B? And if you can figure out that they don't have A in their hand, you now know you only need to play around B. And the main way you figure this stuff out is if your opponent uses something that you wouldn't expect, or the opponent doesn't take opportunities to play a key unit, your opponent doesn't use a combat trick you think they would use, think what you would do if you have the perfect hand in their position. And if they do something different, it may be they don't have that perfect hand, and then you can start working out what they might have and what they definitely don't have. And going back to the example previously, in this example, my opponent uses Gotcha and Mystic Shot to go for Shen. This is a clear example he doesn't have Thermo Beam. My next tip is blocking. And with blocking, you always need to just get as much value as you can. Trade your lower statted units for your opponent's higher statted units, and consider your opponent's combat tricks. One thing you need to make sure of when blocking though is consider your opponent's options for leaf. If your opponent has certain removal spells, things like Get Excited, Decimate, make sure you're not in that 3 or 4 health range that your opponent can kill you with 1 spell. But you need to consider, are you removing any chance of you winning by blocking this way, and therefore you need to take some risk. In an example here, my life total isn't under threat, and I make the decision not to block the Puffcat Peddler, even though he gets great trades onto the board. That's because my opponent runs cards like Avalanche and Blighted Ravine, both of which could kill Puffcat Peddler or force me to use a protective spell if I use it to block. So in that case, I'm using my Nexus health as a resource. I'm taking 1 more damage, and this way I don't need to use Troll Chant to protect Puffcat Peddler. My next tip is whether to attack or develop. In general, people make a lot of mistakes of choosing to open attack because they look at the board and go, oh, I've got a good attack if I open attack, so I'll take it. But you could be missing out key damage, which could become crucial later on in the game. What I always say is you always look to develop, and only if you have a good reason not to develop, do not. And what are the good reasons not to develop? Either your opponent has a slow spell, which can mess you up a lot. The other thing is if your opponent has better development. And here's an example of using development well. My opponent's best development here is either using a Rekindler to summon fresh or playing a Gangplank. And neither of these are better than my Dragon. Obviously a Gangplank is better stats wise, but then I can use the Dragon plus buffs to kill his Gangplank. So here I'm absolutely happy to develop before I attack. My next tip is you should always be reactive. Waiting for your opponent to do stuff, knowing what your opponent's done and playing with 100% of the information is so much stronger than playing and hoping for the best or trying to guess what your opponent's going for and going for a 50-50 decision. Especially in the lower ranks, this is such a big tip because I see people always just want to, oh, I want to use my mana, I want to use my mana, I want to use my mana. So I'd highly recommend passing when possible. To be able to pass, you need to be in one of two positions, which is either you have to be the slower deck, or you can also pass as the more aggressive deck, but you need to be in a position where you don't have the attack token and you're already happy with the existing board state. Great example of using passing is this game I played against an elusive deck. As my opponent has the urgency to make stuff happen, he can't afford to do nothing. But with anything he plays, I can guarantee make a stronger reactive play because I'm banking all my mana, I have all my mana available. He has to keep playing proactively because he's the faster deck. And in the end, I just grind him out of resources because playing with 100% of the information, knowing exactly which combat tricks he uses, I can use the best combat tricks to counter. Tip number 7 is to be patient. This is not like other card games out there. Your opponent can always react and respond to what you're doing. In this example here, I have the potential of going for lethal here by playing axes onto Draven, but my opponent has plenty of spells which could send Draven back to my hand. So I do a slightly less committal play. I play Flurry of Fists, which would get my opponent down to 1 HP, but I don't commit the axes just so I could use them later on in the game if my opponent had something like Homecoming. In this example, there might be a small argument to use the axes just because I had so many, but hopefully this shows you the idea that you need to always be thinking about what your opponent can do. Tip number 8 is to know the meta. There are many sites out there. The main one I use is Mobalytics, and if you go onto meta stats page, gives you a great list of what the common decks are. You can click on them and find the exact deck list. So if you go against a deck on ladder, most people net deck and take the exact list and don't change it at all. So you can get perfect lists, know if they run 1 of the cards, 2 of the cards, 3 of the cards, and you can use this information to work out exactly what you play around, what your opponent's more likely to have in hand, make better decisions. So I highly recommend, if you're tryharding for time, bring up Mobalytics on your phone or on a spare screen or just wherever and check out what your opponent's running. It helps an absolute ton when you're tryharding to climb. Tip 9 is to focus on optimal play and not results, because it's a card game, there is chance involved. You can play perfectly and lose, and you can play poorly and win. So you need to really think about each of your decisions. Was it the best play in that scenario? Was there something your opponent could have done to counter it? Don't just play mindlessly. If you're serious about trying to improve, think and question every single decision. This will help you absolutely ton. It doesn't matter whether you make the right decision or not. If you think about it, go through the process, next time the decision comes around, you'll know what to do. Our final tip, and this is more of a tip for me. If you've watched any of my games, I play very fast, and you should just slow down when you play. Take 10 seconds to think before every action. My snap plays are sometimes so stupid. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm 100% gonna do this, 100% do this. Straight away, as soon as my turn, do it, and then immediately regret it after 2 seconds because I'm like, oh, I could have had this combat trick or this spell. So just take a little bit of time to think about things, make sure you considered all the options. I don't mean like excessively rope. You don't need to rope every single turn. And finally, a bonus tip for those of you who stuck around for the whole video, teching your deck to the meta is so important. And a great example of this is we've been in a meta where Azir Aurelia has been quite strong for a while, and I was playing around with my fun Retired Reckoner combo deck. And I actually ended up adding in Culling Strikes to this deck just to deal with Azir Aurelia because the matchup was horrendous. And it actually ended up being insane and so helpful. Like, it turned the matchup from being unfavored to slightly favored. And when you're trying to climb, especially with off-meta decks, or maybe something you've just net decked, but you go against different things from that player you've net decked from, you should really think about cards you can bring in or tech in to help you with the meta you're facing. Not the meta other people are facing, tech cards for what you end up facing where you are in ladder. So that's all my tips. If you want to see these tips applied, check out some of my gameplay videos.